Ashley, and today we're going to wrap up our perspective series. And so this is going to be a finished painting that's layering in all of the different things that we've talked about with atmospheric perspective. I'm going to use 2-point perspective on this one, and then we're going to look at how we use overlapping, layering, that kind of thing to really pull it all together. So this is kind of the wrap up and bonus video of this series. So let's flow right into it. First things first, I'm going to do my sketch. And so with perspective, you don't have to do a sketch, but if you're trying for like 2-point perspective or 3-point perspective, it's going to be a little bit easier if you start with a sketch. So I'm doing this reference photo, so I'll put it up here, and adapting it just a little bit. This is a photo that I took in Ireland. I can't remember where, but it was one of the parks. Beautiful lake. And we're going to do the cottage, and then this has a nice deep background with the lake and the mountains, so we can build in that atmospheric perspective as well. So to start with, we're just going to get the cottage drawn in. So I have already sketched this out just because it does take a little bit longer and I wanted to get through it a little bit faster, but I lightened it up. I'm going to go over the lines just to talk about what I did. So first we have kind of our horizon line, which I made the edge of the lake here. So there's the edge of the lake in the background. Okay. And then here's the front edge of the lake. There's going to be kind of a tree coming out here. Okay. We have the mountains in the background. So we have a couple layers of mountains. Okay. So there's the first layer. And then we have the back one that's going to be more faded. This will have some distinctions in it with different, like parts of it are going to be more tree lined, parts of it are going to be more grassy. And then there's going to be a layer of kind of evergreen trees coming in along maybe here. Okay, some evergreens. So those are going to kind of be triangle shapes. And then we have the cottage itself. So we'll start with the driveway leading up to the cottage, and that's going to point off into this direction back here. So our point on the horizon is somewhere around here, okay? So I'm gonna put that point there. And so part of our road is basically pointing straight at that line, okay? So I'm gonna do these walls along the driveway. So if my line's here, then I'm gonna do angling both of them in. And this one, again, it's pointing basically straight at it. So you're not gonna see the sides of these walls. And so to make it believable, you really need to have that angle where these lines are converging in the back so that it looks like this is closer to you and this is farther away. And then there's a little space here for like a walkway. And then we have another one. So I'm going to put a slightly narrower wall there. Okay. Now this line here is our second line, right? So we have our one point on the horizon here. Our other point is going to be way out here off to the side. It's not even going to be in the frame of the painting. So this line is going to eventually come toward the horizon line out here. So it should be angled up slightly since it is below the horizon line. Okay, so anything that's below the horizon line is going to angle up toward the horizon, but it's really subtle because this is a very far point. So it's a subtle angle up. This one also is that subtle angle up. Okay, and then our verticals are going to be straight vertical. We don't angle our verticals. Okay, so there's our first wall. Then if we look at our second wall, it's gonna come on this side. Here's the driveway right here, okay? So these are gonna angle back this way toward this point, okay? So I'm gonna start with the front one again and get that in. So it's a little bit wider toward closer to us, and then it's converging as we go back. And then this is angling again slightly up toward the horizon line. Vertical stays vertical, and then our line here is going to angle down so that it's getting wider as it comes toward us. Okay, and then basically here I'm just extending this line with a little gap for a walkway for both of these to make the second part of the wall. Okay. So there we have our kind of driveway, right? So then we're gonna get into starting to build our cottage. So I'm gonna use a line that's gonna be right outside this wall for the edge of the house. Okay, that gives me a target to hit. And then the bottom of the house. So again, this is gonna angle slightly up toward our horizon line. Okay, so my point's way out here somewhere. And so I'm angling slightly up. So it doesn't have to be super precise, but as long as everything that's below the horizon is aiming up and everything that's above the horizon line is aiming down, and you're gradually shifting that angle, you're gonna have a pretty good 2-point perspective, okay? So here's a vertical that stays straight, and my verticals for my doors here are gonna be straight. Now this horizontal, because it's closer to the horizon line, isn't gonna angle as much, but it's still gonna angle up. Okay, same with the roof line. So as we get closer to the horizon line, it's angling less. This one points toward this point, so it's angling in slightly because it's just off to the side of it. It's a vertical though, that actually doesn't matter that much, but I kind of like the way that lines up. But like this one isn't going to aim there because it is a vertical. It's just like a triangle roof. So kind of ignore that statement, but it worked for that one. Okay, so there's kind of the first part of our cottage. Then we have the wall coming out here. It's gonna come out to the edge of this driveway wall. A vertical, again, nice and straight here. Okay, now we have the roof line of the other part of the cottage, which is going to angle up slightly toward the horizon. Again, okay, and then we're just going to put our triangle roof on. And now the top of the roof is going to be above the horizon line, so it's going to angle slightly down toward our point. Okay, so I'm just going to make sure that we're getting that angle down. Okay, the back half part of the roof here, and you're going to see the eaves there, so I'm just going to draw that in so I don't forget. And then whenever we do windows and things, same thing. So this window is going to angle up slightly toward the horizon. Our verticals stay vertical. Okay, this window is going to angle up a little bit. Okay, now I'm going to put in just a little bit of the wall over here. So the front of this house is going to be covered with bushes and plants. So that's going to create depth also because obviously it's obscuring things behind it. So you know that the bush is going to be in front of the house because it's obscuring, okay? And this wall is going to be in front of this bush because it's obscuring the bush. Maybe we'll have the bush come out kind of over the wall a little bit just to create some more layering, okay? So same with down here, there might be a wall for this kind of flower bed, but there's going to be parts of it that are obscured by the bushes. Now on that wall, I'm angling it up a little bit more sharply than like these lines and the roof lines because it's farther away from the horizon line. Okay, so there's our flower bed wall. Okay. Now for everything else, in terms of the landscape, that can just be done as we go. We don't have to draw everything in, but like I did kind of get an idea of how high these bushes are gonna go so that I knew where to draw my windows. And then they're gonna go out to about here so that I know what I need to include in the background. And then I'm gonna put a big bush here that's blocking part of the lake. Now, my last part of the house that we're gonna do is the chimney. So we're gonna get in 2 verticals. Sometimes it's easier to start with the verticals because we know that they're gonna be straight, okay? So there's my verticals. And then my horizontal here is above the horizon line. So it's basically gonna follow the line of the roof. It's a little tiny bit less angled, but it's close enough that you're not really gonna notice. And then the one up here is going to angle a little bit sharper, and that's gonna really reinforce that perspective, okay? Now, this other line, it's gonna angle toward our point down here. So that one's pretty sharp down, okay? And as we build up our chimney, I'm just keeping those angles in mind. So a little bit shallower angle on the left side, and then a sharper angle on the right. Okay, and this is kind of flares out a little bit toward the top of the chimney. So I'm going to build that in. And then there's like a metal part that comes out the top, I guess. I know nothing about chimneys, but I'm just using my reference photo and getting it close enough. Okay, so there's our basic house in 2-point perspective. So now I am gonna lighten the drawing back up some just by dabbing my kneaded eraser on it. Okay. And then we're gonna start painting it. So this is a pretty small watercolor paper sheet. This is 4x6 and it's Arches watercolor paper. I did trim this from a full sheet. So these were kind of leftover pieces that I did the 4x6s for. So we don't need huge brushes. I am probably going to use a big, large brush for the background. So this is a size 16. These are Degato round artist brushes. They're from Amazon. I like them. They don't shed. They hold their point really well. They're pretty durable, so I like them. I'm probably going to use these mostly. This is going to be a fairly loose painting, but even with the looseness, because we have in our kind of architecture, our 2-point perspective drawn in, even if I make the painting loose, the perspective is going to stay intact. So let's start with our background. So our sky is just kind of a moody gray. This is in Ireland. It rains all the time there, which is beautiful and I love it. But the skies are not bright blue usually. So we're just gonna do a nice gray for the sky. And we're gonna pull that wash down into our hills. Okay, and that can get us start of some wet on wet there. Now, I'm not super concerned if I go over the chimney or the roof a little bit on the hill, on the house, because those are darker colors, but I don't want to go over the main part of the house because that is going to be white. So I want to make sure that I don't paint over that. So right now I'm just getting everything else wet basically, besides the house and the walls here. Okay, now we can start with some greens. So these are going to be some like grayed out greens, not vivid greens. So I'm just going to use some leftovers in my palette, mostly, to create some greens. I'm using cobalt blue with some of these pinks and reds that were in here, and then a little bit of my yellow, which is the lemon yellow deep. And that gets me a very gray green. So the background one's going to be a little bit more grayish blue. And I don't care if it bleeds up into the sky. This is where we're using our atmospheric perspective. Okay, so our background painted wet on wet is a very good technique to get that atmospheric perspective, because you're creating those soft lines naturally without having to work very hard. So watercolor is beautiful for using atmospheric perspective. Okay, now we're adding a little bit more intensity to our greens, and I'm gonna make the hill in the front slightly more intense, slightly more saturated color. Okay. Blending out that top line a little bit. Add a little bit more of my blue gray in there. Okay. And then I'm going to vary that green as I go across. So parts of it are going to be a little bit more brown, parts of it are going to be a little bit more yellow, and parts are going to be a little bit more blue, just to get some variety in that hill. So I'm kind of dabbing, I'm not painting the whole thing in a smooth wash, because I just want some variation in the color. This is gonna have like bushes and stuff over here, so I'm just gonna kind of get that green. The chimney here is going to be a red brick, so I'm kind of using my most intense green there to create a little bit of contrast. So the green against the red, they're complementary colors, and so that's going to create some more contrast. If you're interested in color theory and how to do all of that, I do have a whole nother series on color theory. That was a series that I did last. And so you can look up that playlist and you're going to find a whole bunch of information on color theory, and it'll pull in a lot of things like that, where I talk about color contrast and how to use it effectively in your paintings. So, and then just add a little bit more darkness to some of these areas. Again, focusing here on the transition between the background hill and the foreground hill. Get a little bit more browns in. Okay. And it can be loose. It doesn't have to be precise or anything. And I'm just gonna blend that out just a little bit. Okay. Now we're gonna work on some evergreens. So that's gonna be a much more true green here. And I don't want it to be a lime green, so I'm going to add a little bit more darkness here and add in a little bit of red to gray it out some. So I'm just gonna start by tapping some of that in. This is wet on wet, so it's not gonna get precise lines here at the top. They're gonna diffuse out, they're gonna bleed out. So I'm kind of painting in the top line there, and then for the bottom, I'm gonna add a little bit more darkness by mixing in some pink to my green. And that's gonna make a kind of purpley shadow color. And we're gonna add that in to the bottom to create interest, texture, and variety. But again, this is background still, so I don't want a ton of details. Okay, so our background is kind of transitioning toward midground, but it's not there yet. So it can be a little bit more detailed than the actual background, but we don't want it to be as detailed as our foreground. Just gonna add the tops of some of those trees there. Okay, so there is, again, that background. And I did leave a pretty distinct line here because that's where the lake is gonna be. So just kind of smooth that out. This is gonna be a tree, so it doesn't matter if it's green, but I did leave it fairly unpainted. Okay, for this tree, I want to paint that wet on dry because I do want that edge to be fairly crisp. And same with my lake, I'm gonna paint it wet on dry. So I am gonna go ahead and take a pause here and let this dry for just a minute. Okay, I'm gonna shift to a smaller brush. So this is a size 10 round, which is significantly smaller than the size 16 in this brand, in most brands. One note about brush sizes is they're not consistent across brands. So a 16 in one brand is not going to be the same as a 16 in another, which is kind of annoying. They might be close, but it's not exactly the same. Okay, so for the lake, I'm going to take some of my blue-gray and just basically paint that in. I want to leave a little bit of white space to look like light catching on the lake. So I'm gonna hold my brush flat to the page and drag it across, and that's gonna get that impression of that glistening water, okay? And that's it. That's all I'm gonna do on the lake because again, it's mid-ground, so I do have some detail by doing the dry brushing and leaving that white space, but I don't want so much detail that it's overwhelming. Now for this tree here, I'm gonna put in some yellow up along the edge where the light would be catching it the most. And it's gonna create a little bit of contrast with the background. And then I'm gonna start building in a little bit more of my darker greens. And this is close to the house, which is basically our focal point, so it can be a little bit more detailed as well. Because not only do you want things that are more in the foreground more detailed, you want things closer to your focal point more detailed as well. I have no idea what kind of tree this is. I'm just kind of making it up. getting a little bit of a willow vibe. I don't know if willows are even a thing in Ireland, but that's what we're going with. Okay, so there's that tree. Now we need to put in some grass. And this is kind of how I typically work. I usually work kind of back to front in my scene with watercolor, especially because the background is going to be more faded out, more low intensity colors. And in watercolor, you want to start with lower intensity and build your way up to your brighter and darker value colors. So that's kind of how I work. Plus, doing the washes that way just works better for me. So now here I'm painting in just some grass, and I'm just using kind of a flat wash here, and I'll add some shadows in a minute. Now, since it's an overcast day, the shadows aren't really gonna be very dark or deep. So that kind of makes it a little bit easier, but under things, you're still gonna have some shadows, okay? So, let's see, I'm gonna do kind of a walkway there. I'm just kind of making this up now because I didn't draw this part in. So grass will come up to about where this walkway would be. Now, toward the front, we're going to have our warmer colors, our brighter colors. That's our atmospheric perspective. Warmer toward the front, cooler toward the back. So as we move back, I'm going to add a little bit more blue in to the grass. Okay. This looks a little funky here, so I'm going to kind of lift that up. So I don't know what's happening there, but it's not right. So I'm just erasing it basically. I feel like that should be more lake, so I'm going to do that instead. And just kind of add in a little bit of blue there. There we go. And then I can put the tree trunk in front of it. That works. Okay, so now a little bit of shadow underneath, like this bush here. There we go. And then maybe a little bit of shadow here. So for the shadow, I'm just adding a little bit of more pink into that green. So it's a little bit muted, and it's also going to be a little bit more blue too that I'm adding. Okay, that works. Now we're going to paint this bush here, and I think I just want it to be like a green bush. I'm not going to make it a flowering one. I'll put the flowering ones all in front of the house. Okay. Now, I'm not being crazy, like precise on any techniques here. I'm just kind of dabbing in color. Okay, and then again, I want to vary that color a little bit as I move through the bush, just like I did in the hills. I don't want it to be one flat color. That's the thing with greens, is there's a billion different shades of green in nature. So even if you have a very green heavy painting, which this is, you can create enough variety by just adding more blues, more yellows, and then adding in some pinks to mute it, that it keeps it interesting, even though it's just green, basically. Okay, so now for the house, let's go ahead and get that painted. I'm gonna get a red color mixed up here. So this is my red well. It's all messy, and I'm just gonna use that because that's a beautiful kind of brick red color. already, so I don't have to recreate the wheel here. And this isn't about color mixing, so just know that sometimes using the leftovers in your palette is going to be your best option for things. Okay, and then I'll probably add a little bit of brown on this also, just to deepen it up a little bit. Okay, and then I'm going to grab some yellow ochre. It's kind of an earthy, bricky color, I guess. A little bit more red. And just kind of tapping that in to get the variations. Now for shadow, I'm going to do kind of on the corner here, I'm going to do a darker line to distinguish where the change of direction is. And then under where the next layer of bricks starts, I'm going to do it darker. And then we're going to add another layer here. Doing that a little bit lighter so that I can add in those shadows in a second. Okay, a little bit of yellow ochre in that. And I'm just tapping, I'm not doing anything crazy. And I'm still using my size 10 round brush, which is kind of large for this, but it works because it has a nice point. If your brush doesn't have as fine of a point, then you might want to go to a smaller brush. Okay, so now I'm going to add in some more layers of shadow here. So we have another line here. There we go. And then we have where it kind of flares out a little bit. I'm going to draw that in. And then the top is kind of a gold color. I think I'm just going to use some yellow ochre for that. Okay. Maybe lift a little bit of a highlight on one side. It's so small, you're not really going to see it that much, but that's okay. All right, now our roof is a like slate gray. So I'm going to take my same blue from the sky, that's just whatever was left over in this well, and I'm going to add just a little bit more of a brown to it. So this is burnt sienna, which is an orangey brown, and that orange and blue make gray. Okay, and I want it to be a little bit blue bias still. And then I'm just gonna kind of do similar to what I did on the lake. It's gonna be a little bit more filled in, so I don't have quite as dry of a brush, but I'm still gonna do some dry brushing here. Okay, but it's gonna be more solid. Okay, and then same with this section over here. This is darker because it's more in the shadows. So it's not going to have as much light coming off of it. There we go. And then we have the underside of the roof. over here that we want to make sure we get painted in. Okay, now we have some green in the cottage, like the doors and the window frames are going to be a green color. So let me get that mixed up. I want this to be a more vivid green because this is paint. So it's not going to be as natural of a color, right? So house paint can be whatever color you want. It doesn't have to be a color found in nature. Okay, and we're going to use that to paint in the doors here. And this is basically just, coloring in now because we have the perspective all drawn out. So now it's just coloring in those shapes and then adding shadows to pull out the rest of the depth, making sure that we're using our overlapping as well. So like when I come over to these windows, I'm going to make sure that I'm painting just what's showing around the bushes, not anything else. Okay. So I'm just gonna get in a window frame here. And then thinking of the perspective here, so if you just kind of imagine looking at this house, if you're not looking straight on, if you're looking at an angle, you're not going to see stuff that's tucked underneath or behind things. So like this part of the window, we're not going to see as much as the other side. So I'm going to do a thinner line here just to show that we're seeing a little bit of it, but not all of it. Okay. All right, and then I'm gonna do this same color kind of on the edge of the roof. And on this side underneath. The front. Okay, and then we're gonna add some like downspout things. What are these called? I don't know. Anyway, the things that take the rain away. Add that in. Just to add some details on the house. Make it a little bit more interesting. Okay. And then our house is still looking very flat, and that's because we don't have any shadows on the walls themselves. So we're gonna come back and do some shadows now. So I'm just gonna take some gray, and I'm gonna warm up the gray just a little bit by adding a little bit more burnt sienna to it, because the house is basically white, but it's kind of a warm white. So our shadows are gonna be a little bit slightly warmer also. Okay, and then I'm going to take that color and add in shadow underneath where the roof is coming out over the house. Okay. And then this wall is going to be shadowed as well. I'm just gonna put that whole shadow there. And then there's gonna be the shadows, kind of the windows are gonna be darker. It's not really shadow, but that glass, I'm just gonna make them gray. Okay. And then we're just gonna soften up the shadow under the eaves here a little bit. Okay. Put a little bit of a line along the edges. A little bit of shadow on the side of the spout things. Okay, so that's creating depth already by just doing that. Now let's get in our driveway here. And that is a stone driveway. It's not really like asphalt, not pavement. So I'm gonna add in some dots of color to show that there's some variegation in it. Lift up some areas. Create a little bit more variety and value, and it's a little bit lighter toward the back and darker toward the front. Okay, so same thing with then our walkway here. We're gonna have some gray, a little bit of some burnt sienna in there. Okay. All right. Now we're gonna paint these bushes here. So they're gonna have some kind of pink flowers on them. So I'm just gonna get some permanent rose, mix it with water and whatever else is in this well to get some variety. And I'm gonna put in kind of some pink, just dots. I'm not going crazy here with it. Not trying to paint specific flowers necessarily. The one, oops, well that's okay. It's going over the wall. And apparently there's a whole trail of flowers there because I pressed too hard. That's okay. Okay, now greens. Just gonna kind of dab them in around those pinks. Some areas are going to be more dense than others. So if I leave some white space, again, this is a loose painting. White space is acceptable in a loose painting. It's acceptable in any painting. You can paint however you want. But especially loose paintings, you want to use your white space kind of effectively. And I'm just varying the green a little bit, warmer and cooler. Again, just to make sure we have variety here. So some areas, again, it's spilling out over the wall and into the walkway maybe. Okay. And then we're gonna do some ivy climbing on the walls here. So we're gonna get just some green and have it climbing behind. Again, some areas it's going to be more dense than others. Get some of that same color in between. Okay. Now I need to put some bushes over here. So this I'm going to just kind of get some green and do some splotches and dry brushing and things. So we're going to have some coming out in front of the house here. And then as we go up, we're going back into the painting. So it's going to be more muted and cooler tones. And it's not going to be in front of the house anymore. It's going to tuck in behind. Okay, so just kind of fade that out with dry brushing. Add a little bit more detail here to the front, especially along the edges. Okay, that works. Now I need to paint these walls still. So we're going to do our gray color again for the stone. And it's going to be a more blue-gray color here because that is definitely in the shadow underneath the bushes here. Okay, and then we'll use that same color. Okay, so we're going to paint in these walls now along the driveway. And so these are stone also. So my sides are going to be a little bit darker because they're going to be shadowed. And the top is gonna catch more of the light. Adding a little bit more darkness right along the bottom to distinguish it from the driveway from the path. Okay. Lifting up just a little bit so that I can get the opening here. So by lifting and highlighting that, it shows that there's a change there, something different. Darkening up the end of this one here. There we go. And then the top is going to be lighter. But we still need to define the edge there a little bit. Okay. There we go. Now, the final step to a painting like this to really bump up that depth the most is contrast. So we have really good architecture with our 2-point perspective. We have excellent atmospheric perspective here going on in the background, but the house still looks just a little bit flat because there isn't enough contrast between the lights and the darks. So I'm gonna put in a little bit more darkness in these shadows. It'll be a little bit bluer. So we're going to add that darkness there. We're going to add a little bit of shadow under where the ivy is clinging. Okay. A little bit more shadow to this wall. It's going to feel pretty dark, but it does dry lighter, so that is something to keep in mind when you're using watercolor. And then I'm going to put some more blue into the roof. Still keeping it gray, so I'm adding ultramarine and burnt sienna. But we're going to make our roof a little bit more blue, a little bit darker. And so I'm dry brushing this on. This is a very dry mix here. I don't have very much water in it at all. And we're just dry brushing it on to create darkness, but also more texture. Now, if I want to smooth out some areas, I'm just going to add a little bit of water to smooth it out a tad. Okay. Okay, so that already increased our depth a little bit and the contrast. I'm going to add a bit more darkness under some of these bushes. So basically this is ultramarine with just a touch of lemon yellow to make it more green, but it's pretty much ultramarine blue. But add a little bit more darkness toward the bottom. Get some of those shadows in. Same thing over here, bump up that depth and contrast on this bush. Okay. I need to add a tree trunk in here for whatever this tree is in the background. So just getting some brown mixed up. Now I don't want it to be too textured and too detailed because it is in the background. So we're gonna lift a little bit to lighten it up and to get rid of some of the texture. There we go. And maybe a little bit more shadow on this wall. There we go. Kind of adding in a darker line at the bottom of it to distinguish where the path and the wall meet, because it kind of looked like one just gray blob versus that vertical versus horizontal surface. Okay, now for the door, I need to add some detail there. Make it more interesting instead of just flat green. Okay, so add some darkness for shadow. There we go. And then I'm gonna add a little bit of that dark green to the roof also. Just make that a little bit darker. Yeah. Now, line down the center, because this is a double door. Maybe make it a little bit more gray. So I'm just using Payne's gray to darken it, since that's a bluish gray. Okay. And then put in some door panes here. Now in theory, these should also follow the perspective lines. So anything below the horizon is going to be angled up slightly. But it's so small that it's not going to matter too much as long as you're not super off. Okay, so just some hints at some detail there. It's not anything crazy, just hinting at it. And then add just a little bit of darker green inside these, so that they look shadowed and kind of recessed in. Okay. And maybe just a little bit more darkness at some of the windows. Okay. There is, I'm gonna do a kind of window here too. I don't want it to be that green, I decided. So let me get some gray. There we go. That just adds a little bit of interest on this side. But yeah, so that's basically it. So we have our different techniques that build in depth using perspective. So we have atmospheric perspective, which is really evident in the background, going from our lighter, cooler values to our darker and warmer, more intense values. Then we have kind of size too. I didn't talk about size much, but the house proportionally is much larger than these evergreen trees. In reality, the trees are going to be huge compared to this house, but because this is closer, it's bigger. Same with this tree in the background. Like, these bushes are nearly the same size as that tree, but the tree's farther back, so it's smaller. I didn't really talk about that much. You can, with different compositions, you can push that more, but that size and scale is a very important part of creating depth as well. So then we have our overlap. So our house is clearly in front of the tree, trees in front of the lake, so we can create depth with overlap. Then we have our actual 2-point perspective that we did with our, so like this flat road is converging up to this point, and then anything that's facing us more is converging off to a point over here off to the side. So these front planes of our building are converging this direction, and then anything that's going back is converging back here. So that's basically how we pull all of our techniques in perspective into a painting. Okay, so if you have any questions or anything like that, leave them in the comments. But this is just sort of quick, not super quick, but sort of quick version of pulling all of those perspective techniques together. So the thing to really remember with this is that perspective can be very technical, but you don't have to let it be a super big constraint for you, as long as you use some of the techniques. So for example, in this one, I talked a lot about anything above the horizon line is going to angle down, anything below is going to angle up. Converging lines, using those techniques, even if you use them imprecisely, is going to give you that impression of depth utilizing the techniques of perspective. So you can still play with it, you can still be loose in your paintings, but using parts of those techniques and at least understanding the techniques is going to help you create depth in your watercolor paintings. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, keep those paints flowing.